bare, yet every inch seemed to close in, pressing. The silence was thick. Heavy. It clung to everything, suffocating any thought. Alan sat in the chair, motionless. His fingers twitched, but he didn't move. His eyes darted around the room, but they never met anyone else's. He had lost his grip. The lies, the web he had woven, tangled him tighter than ever. Carla. Her name echoed in his mind, but it was no longer just a name. It was the sound of everything unraveling. A rush of guilt, or was it fear? It didn't matter. The lie had turned into something far worse. The door opened. The cold air rushed in, making Alan shiver. Footsteps approached slowly, methodical. Each step was deliberate, like a countdown. He knew who it was. Detective Marshall. He had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for Alan to crack. The silence between them grew louder. Marshall stood there for a moment. The weight of the situation settled over them both. Alan could feel his heartbeat thumping in his chest. It was too loud. Too obvious. "Do you want to talk?" Marshall asked. Alan blinked. His mouth felt dry. He opened it, but no words came out. Then, Marshall spoke again. "Alan, tell us the truth." The air seemed to grow even colder. Alan's throat tightened. His pulse raced as the room seemed to close in even more. There was nowhere left to run. No lies to hide behind. Just the truth, raw and brutal. His eyes shifted to the door. To freedom. But the door was no longer an escape. It was just another reminder. A reminder of the lives lost. Of the lives he had stolen. The truth was waiting. And it was louder than the lies ever could be. Alan felt it. The weight of it. Crushing him. Each word felt like a noose tightening around his neck. It was time. Time to face what he had done. His hands trembled as he reached for the chair's armrest. The cold metal felt foreign, biting into his skin. He couldn't remember the last time he truly felt anything. Not since the first lie, the first decision that had set everything in motion. Marshall didn't move. He just waited, his gaze unwavering. It was like the detective could see straight through him. There was nowhere to hide. Alan swallowed hard. The words, the truth, it was all too much. But there was no way out. No way to run from what had happened. The image of Carla's face flashed in his mind. Her eyes wide with terror, disbelief. Her lips trembling as she whispered for mercy. But mercy had never been on the table. A crackling noise. A soft click of the chair leg against the floor. It was too loud. Alan's hands clenched the armrests tighter. "Alan," Marshall said again, this time softer, almost gentle. But Alan knew it wasn't out of kindness. It was a trap. A way to coax the truth from him. Alan's chest tightened. His heart beat erratically, almost painfully. He wanted to say something, anything, but his voice was gone. A lump rose in his throat. The room seemed to spin. Darkness crept into the corners of his vision. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one harder than the last. Then, a small sound. A whisper, perhaps from his own mind. "Confess." It was barely audible, but it struck him like a thunderclap. His body jerked, his breath caught. The weight of the word felt like 1,000 tons pressing down on him. "Tell us," Marshall repeated, his voice no longer gentle. It was firm, unyielding. There was no escape now. Alan closed his eyes. The room was still spinning. But he knew. He knew he had to speak. And when he did, it wasn't the words that broke him. It was the truth. The horrible, crushing truth. Carla, she didn't deserve it. His voice cracked, barely a whisper. But the words hung in the air. They were enough to make everything fall apart. Alan felt his shoulders slump. The weight he had been carrying for so long was finally too much to bear. The truth had come out. And with it, everything he had built crumbled into dust. The silence that followed was unbearable. It wrapped around him like a vice. Alan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The truth hung between them, thick and suffocating. Marshall didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. He let the silence stretch. Let Alan feel the full weight of his confession. Alan's pulse pounded in his ears. His chest tightened further. Each breath felt like an effort, like he was drowning in the space between words. The room was colder now, if that was possible. The air felt damp, clinging to his skin. A single bead of sweat dripped down his temple. "Why?" Marshall finally asked. The question cut through the silence with brutal clarity. Alan's eyes fluttered. He didn't know how to answer. How could he? It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anything he had told himself. The truth, when it came, was simple. He had done it because he could. There had been a moment. A moment when the lies, the manipulation, had felt powerful. Like he was in control. But now that power was gone. I don't know, Alan whispered. His voice was shaky, like a leaf in the wind. The words tasted bitter, sour on his tongue. I thought I could get away with it. Marshall didn't speak. He just watched. His gaze steady, unblinking. Alan's body trembled. It was the weight of his own guilt crashing over him. The magnitude of what he had taken. He could still see Carla's face. Still hear her voice, pleading. Her eyes wide, full of shock, of betrayal. He had murdered her. Coldly. Without mercy. The room seemed to shrink again. The walls closing in, suffocating him. He felt the walls of the universe crumble around him. There was nowhere left to hide. Alan closed his eyes. The darkness was welcome now. It wasn't the freedom he had hoped for. But it was all that was left. Alan, Marshall said, his voice soft but final. It's over. The words seemed to echo in Alan's skull. It was over. But nothing would ever be the same again. Alan's mind spun. The weight of those words slammed into him. It's over. But was it? Was it really over? The lies had piled so high, he couldn't remember where they started. Each lie had led to another, and another. Until now, there was nothing left to hold on to. His hands gripped the edge of the chair so hard his knuckles turned white. He could feel the blood pulsing beneath his skin, but it wasn't real. Nothing felt real. Not anymore. The room felt like it was closing in tighter. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his chest. The sound was deafening. And then, for a moment, everything was still. Do you understand what you've done? Marshall asked. His voice had softened again, but it wasn't gentle. It was a statement. A cold reminder of the reality Alan had tried to escape. Alan nodded, though he wasn't sure if he could even form words. His throat was dry. His lips cracked open, but no sound came out. What was there to say? He had killed her. Carla. The woman he had once promised to protect. She had been everything to him. Or had she? He had convinced himself she was a threat. A barrier to his freedom. And so he had destroyed her. His hands shook uncontrollably. His entire body trembled now. The guilt, the truth, it was too much. There were no more lies. No more excuses. Only the silence of what he had done. Marshall stepped closer. He was right in front of him now. Alan could smell the faint scent of his cologne, the sharp edge of his presence. It felt like the air had turned to concrete. You can't take it back, Marshall said softly. But you can face it. The finality in his words left no room for escape. Alan blinked, and suddenly the floodgates opened. The tears came in waves, hot and uncontrollable. He had never cried before. Not like this. His chest heaved with each breath. The guilt poured out, rushing like a torrent he couldn't stop. Marshall stood still, watching him. There was no pity in his eyes, just cold reality. Alan had always believed he could outsmart the world. But not this time. "Tell us everything," Marshall said, his voice quiet but firm. "Everything, Alan." The darkness felt heavier now. But this time, Alan didn't resist. This time, the truth would come out. It had to. Alan's words hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. His throat was raw from speaking the truth. But somehow, it didn't feel like enough. Not for what he had done. The silence was unbearable now. Every tick of the clock felt like a hammer to his skull. His pulse was still erratic, a drumbeat echoing through his chest. He wanted to run, to escape the suffocating reality. But there was no escaping this. Marshall didn't rush him. He simply waited, standing still, watching. Every second stretched on endlessly. Alan's eyes drifted to the window. The cold light of the outside world barely reaching through the blinds. It seemed so distant. So far from where he was now. I thought I could just walk away," Alan muttered. His voice breaking again. "I thought I could leave it all behind. Start fresh, no one would know. But I couldn't." The words felt hollow, even as he said them. The guilt was too deep, too ingrained. It gnawed at him from the inside out. Carla's face flickered in his mind once more. Her terrified eyes, her last breath. That moment would haunt him forever. No matter how many years passed. No matter how many lies he told. He would never escape her gaze. The truth was there, unrelenting. He couldn't run from it. Not anymore. I didn't mean to kill her," Alan whispered. His words barely audible. I just wanted it all to stop." He felt as though the floor was falling away beneath him. Marshall's eyes never left him. There was no pity there. Only the cold weight of justice. Alan's shoulders slumped. His body finally giving in to the exhaustion of the confession. The fight was over. There was no more strength left in him to deny what he had done. "I took her life," Alan said, almost mechanically now. As if the words had become something separate from him. The finality of them hit harder than anything else. The truth was simple and devastating. "I took her life, and I ruined mine in the process." Marshall didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth had been spoken. And in that moment, Alan knew there would be no going back. The room seemed to grow darker. The weight of what was coming pressed down on him. Heavier than any sentence, than any consequence. It wasn't the legal punishment that would break him. It was the truth that had already torn him apart. "You'll pay for this," Marshall said quietly. But it was more of a statement than a threat. Alan didn't look up. There was nothing left to say. Nothing left to feel. The door opened with a quiet creak. The echo of the hinges filled the silence. A final reminder that this was the end. The end of everything. Alan sat there, motionless. The world outside continued. But for him, time had stopped. His confession had sealed his fate. And the door clicked shut behind him, the sound sharp, final. Alan didn't move. His body felt like it belonged to someone else. Heavy, unfeeling. He was alone now. Completely alone. The silence pressed in again, thick and suffocating. The room felt smaller somehow. The walls creeping closer with each passing second. The light from the window had faded, leaving only shadows in its wake. Alan could hear his heartbeat in his ears. Loud and frantic, as though it was fighting to survive. But there was no escaping the truth. No running from what had been done. He wanted to close his eyes, to block it all out. But the images flooded back, unbidden. Carla's face, pale and frozen in shock. The way her body had crumpled. The blood, the finality of it all. He could still feel her presence in the room. Like a ghost, watching him. Her eyes filled with disbelief. The question that would never be answered. Why? The memories twisted inside him like a knife. Each thought was sharper than the last, cutting deeper into the fragile wall he had built around himself. There was no escape. He had crossed a line that couldn't be erased. No matter how many times he tried to lie to himself, no matter how many excuses he had told himself, he couldn't take back what had happened. Alan's hands were trembling again. He wiped his face, but it only made the sweat and tears smear across his skin. He didn't even recognize the man staring back at him in the reflection of the glass. That man, he wasn't the person he used to be. He was someone broken, lost in his own choices. And the cost of those choices was far beyond anything he had imagined. He could still hear Marshall's words echoing in his head. Asterisk, you'll pay for this. Asterisk. But the price had already been paid. The world outside didn't matter anymore. The people, the places, the life he had thought he could lead. It all seemed so distant now. Like it belonged to another person. The cold, empty room felt like his only reality. The outside world might as well have been a dream. A dream that had long since faded. The door opened again. But this time, it wasn't Marshall who entered. A guard stepped inside, his eyes unreadable. Alan didn't look up. He knew what was coming. He knew it was time. The guard's hand rested on Alan's shoulder. A silent cue to stand. There was no defiance left in him. Slowly, Alan rose. His legs felt weak, like they couldn't hold him up. But somehow, they did. The weight of the hand on his shoulder was like the final tether, pulling him into the reality he had avoided for so long. Without a word, the guard led him out. Into the hallway. Into the unknown. Alan didn't resist. He didn't have the strength. The truth had already shattered him. There was nothing left to fight for. All he could do was walk. One step at a time. Into the future that had been waiting for him all along. The hallway stretched out before him, long and sterile. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie, unnatural glow on the walls. The sound of footsteps echoed in the empty corridor. A steady rhythm that matched the beating of Alan's broken heart. He didn't look back. There was nothing to look back to. Nothing but the lies and the bloodstains that would forever haunt him. The guard's hand remained on his shoulder, guiding him forward. But it felt like the weight of the world was on his back. Heavy, unbearable. They passed other cells along the way. Shadows moved behind the bars, faces peering out, curious. But Alan didn't notice them. His gaze was fixed straight ahead. Eyes unfocused, as if trying to disconnect from the reality around him. But no matter how hard he tried, the truth kept pulling him back. Carla's eyes. Her pleading voice. The blood on his hands. He reached the door at the end of the hall. And for a brief moment, it felt like the last barrier between him and everything he had lost. The door swung open with a metallic groan. Outside, the world continued on as usual. Unaware of the man who had just confessed to taking 2 lives. Alan's eyes squinted against the harsh daylight. The world was bright, blinding almost. A stark contrast to the dark prison of his mind. The guard gave him a gentle push, urging him forward. And Alan stepped into the waiting vehicle. He didn't resist. He didn't have the strength to resist anymore. As the door slammed shut behind him, he felt a deep, hollow emptiness settle inside him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't regret. It was simply nothing. The engine started, and they began to move. But Alan didn't look out the window. He didn't care to see where they were going. It didn't matter. All the miles ahead of him would never be enough to outrun the truth. And as the vehicle drove further into the unknown, Alan realized that the real punishment hadn't even begun. It wasn't the prison. It wasn't the bars or the walls. It was the constant, relentless weight of his own soul. A soul broken beyond repair. There would be no escape. No redemption. Just the slow, inevitable reckoning of what he had done. And in that silence, he knew he would never find peace. The car rumbled down the road, its tires eating up the miles like a countdown to something worse. The windows were rolled up tight, the air inside the car thick with the scent of leather and stale breath. Alan's hands were folded in his lap, the fingers twitching slightly, a nervous habit. But even the tremble of his own hands felt distant. It was as though he were no longer truly inside his body, but floating just above it, watching it all unfold. The world outside seemed like a distant dream. The trees, the houses, the other cars. None of it reached him. It was as if the world had moved on, leaving him behind in the cold prison of his own mind. The car's engine hummed beneath him, a steady rhythm that almost felt comforting, as if it might lull him to sleep. But Alan knew better. There would be no escape in sleep. There was no reprieve from the horrors of his own thoughts. He closed his eyes, but the images rushed in, relentless. Carla's eyes staring at him, wide and terrified. The way her breath had caught in her throat when she realized what he had done. Why? That question echoed in his mind. And every time he thought he might have an answer, it slipped through his fingers like sand. He could hear her voice, soft and pleading. He could still see her face in those last moments. But there was no reason, no justification. Just the cold, hard fact that he had taken her life. The car took a sharp turn, and Alan's body jolted slightly in his seat. It was like a physical reminder that everything was still moving, even though he had already stopped. The driver didn't speak. There was no need for small talk. They both knew where they were headed. The future had already been decided. Alan shifted in his seat, his head leaning back against the cool leather. The tension in his body felt like it would snap. But still, there was nothing, no release. He couldn't help but wonder. Would the weight of his guilt ever lighten? Or would it continue to crush him, day by day, until there was nothing left? The road ahead seemed endless, the landscape blurred by the passing trees, until everything outside the window merged into a single gray blur. But it didn't matter. What mattered was what was coming. What awaited him at the end of this journey? The door. The metal door. The cold bars. The cell that would become his new home. The place where he would live out the rest of his days. Alone with his memories, his guilt, and the crushing weight of the truth. They were nearly there. Alan could feel it. The last mile, the final turn. The car slowed, the wheels turning slowly as the gate came into view. A looming structure made of stone and steel. The place where freedom ended. And as the car pulled into the lot, Alan felt a hollow emptiness fill him completely. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was just nothing. Nothing but the inevitable. The certainty of what lay ahead. The door opened once more, the cold air rushing in. And Alan knew this was it. He stepped out. The world felt unreal. The ground beneath his feet like a distant memory. They led him to the entrance, to the metal doors. And as they swung open, Alan stepped inside. And the world outside disappeared for good. The door slammed shut behind him, and the echo of it was louder than anything he had ever heard. The silence of the cell was deafening. And now, finally, he was trapped. The clang of the door closing behind him reverberated through the concrete walls. It felt final. The last sound of freedom slipping away. Alan stood in the dimly lit corridor, his eyes adjusting to the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights above. The air inside the prison was thick, heavy with the scent of stale sweat, metal, and disinfectant. They didn't speak to him. The guards simply moved, their presence cold, impersonal. One led him down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls, as if the entire building was watching him. Each step felt like a weight, like he was sinking deeper into his own mind. trapped not just in this place, but in the prison of his thoughts. They reached his cell. A small, isolated room at the end of the corridor. The door to it swung open with a creak, and Alan stepped inside. The smell of dust and age hit him immediately. It was empty, barren, except for a small metal bed, a thin, worn mattress, and a toilet in the corner. This was it. This was his new reality. The walls were close, too close. The air too still. He could hear the faint murmurs of other prisoners in the distance. But none of it reached him. He was already too far gone. The guard gave him one last look before shutting the door. Alan heard the click of the lock. And for the first time in his life, he realized the full weight of his isolation. It wasn't just the four walls around him. It wasn't just the iron bars. It was the silence. The suffocating quiet that pressed in from all sides. He sat on the bed, his hands trembling in his lap. The rough fabric of his prison uniform scratched against his skin. He wanted to close his eyes, but he knew there was no escaping the thoughts that would come. No matter how many times he tried to push them away, they always found their way back. Carla, her face, her eyes. The way she had looked at him in her final moments. Her voice was still in his ears. A soft whisper asking, "Why?" Alan closed his eyes. But the image of her wouldn't leave him. It was as if she was still there, in the shadows of his cell. Watching, waiting for him to understand. And he did. He understood now. He had taken everything from her. Her life. Her chance at freedom. Her future. But in doing so, he had lost everything too. No one could save him from this. Not the guards. Not the walls. Not even the escape of sleep. He had crossed a line. And there was no coming back. The hours passed. Or was it days? Time lost all meaning in the oppressive silence of the cell. And then, finally, the darkness began to settle in. The room grew colder. And Alan's mind grew darker. This was the price of his choices. Not just the loss of his freedom, but the loss of his very self. There would be no redemption here. No forgiveness. Just the endless echo of the truth. Repeating, again and again. In the emptiness of his soul. And when the lights finally went out, when the darkness swallowed him whole, there was only one thing left. The silence. The silence that would haunt him. Until the end of his days. The silence was suffocating, as though it had weight. It pressed against Alan's chest, filling his lungs, making every breath feel like an effort. It was as if the world had evaporated, leaving him stranded in this tiny cell. His thoughts the only company. He tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. The mattress was thin and lumpy. Unforgiving, just like the walls that surrounded him. His body ached from the unrelenting tension. But his mind was far worse. Every corner of the room felt like a reminder. The walls, the bed, the harsh flickering light overhead. Everything was a reminder of what he had done. Of who he had become. The memories of Carla haunted him with brutal clarity. Her eyes, wide with shock and betrayal. That moment when she realized the truth. When she realized that her life had been snuffed out by his hand. He could almost feel the weight of that moment. Like a noose tightening around his neck. Why? The question was never far from his mind. And every time he thought he might escape it, it came back sharper. More insistent. Why? There was no answer. There was nothing to say. No excuse, no justification. Just the truth, raw and ugly. He had taken her life. And in doing so, he had erased his own. Days bled into each other in the oppressive stillness. The small window high on the wall provided no comfort. It was too small to see anything beyond the prison walls. Just a sliver of sky. A tiny reminder that there was a world outside. But not for him. The clang of metal bars. The shuffle of footsteps in the corridor. The distant sounds of other prisoners muttering to themselves. This was his world now. And then, one day, there was a knock on the door. It was a sound that pierced the thick veil of silence. And Alan froze. The door creaked open. And a guard stepped inside. He didn't speak at first, just looked at Alan with cold eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Alan's heart hammered in his chest. The oppressive quiet of the cell returning. But only for a brief second. Then the guard said, "You have a visitor." The words landed like a shockwave. A visitor? Who would come for him now? Who could possibly want to see him? After everything he had done? His mind raced. Carla's face flashed before his eyes again. And the familiar weight of guilt slammed into him. The guard didn't wait for Alan to respond. He motioned for Alan to stand. With a deep breath, Alan rose from the bed. His legs shaky. His whole body stiff from days of sitting in the same position. He followed the guard down the hall. The sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick stone walls. His heart was in his throat now. Pounding, rapid. Who could it be? And why now? They reached the visiting area. A sterile room with a small table and 2 chairs. The guard motioned for Alan to sit. Alan's hands trembled as he sat down. Looking up to find the visitor. It was a woman. Her face was unfamiliar at first. But then it hit him. It was Mary. Carla's sister. Her eyes were red. Her face gaunt. As if she hadn't slept in days. But what hit Alan the hardest was the look in her eyes. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't anger. It was sorrow. A sorrow that seemed deeper than anything Alan could ever understand. She stared at him for a long moment. The silence between them thick and suffocating. Then, finally, she spoke. "You're the one who killed her." The words weren't a question. They weren't an accusation. They were just the truth. A simple statement of what Alan already knew. He nodded slowly. His eyes filling with tears. He didn't deserve her forgiveness. He didn't deserve anything. Mary sat down across from him. Her hands trembling as she folded them on the table. "Do you know what you've done?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alan nodded again. Unable to speak. Carla's face was still there. In his mind, in his heart. Her voice still echoed in his ears. And now, in front of him, was the consequence of his actions. The sister of the woman he had taken from the world. "I just want to know why," Mary said, her voice cracking. "Why her? Why did you take her from me?" The question was simple. But Alan couldn't answer it. He couldn't find the words. The truth was too much for him to bear. Too much for anyone to bear. "I'm sorry," he whispered. His voice barely audible. Mary didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, looking at him with a sadness that broke Alan's heart all over again. Finally, she stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you," she said, her voice steady now. "But I wanted you to hear it. The real cost of what you did." And with that, she turned and walked away. Alan sat there, motionless. The weight of her words settling on him like a stone. There was no forgiveness for him. There could be no redemption. Only the silence. The unending silence of the cell. The only place left for him. The door closed behind Mary with a soft, almost respectful click. Her footsteps faded down the hallway. Each step taking her further from him. Further from the world Alan had once known. The room felt colder now. The chair across from him was still warm from her presence. But it might as well have been empty. It was just another reminder of the emptiness he had created. Alan sat there, staring at the spot where she had been. His mind numb. Her words repeated in his ears. He sat on the bed, his hands trembling in his lap. The rough fabric of his prison uniform scratched against his skin. He wanted to close his eyes, but he knew there was no escaping the thoughts that would come. No matter how many times he tried to push them away, they always found their way back. Carla, her face, her eyes. The way she had looked at him in her final moments. Her voice was still in his ears. A soft whisper asking, "Why?" Alan closed his eyes. But the image of her wouldn't leave him. It was as if she was still there, in the shadows of his cell, watching, waiting for him to understand. And he did. He understood now. He had taken everything from her. Her life. Her chance at freedom. Her future. But in doing so, he had lost everything too. No one could save him from this. Not the guards. Not the walls. Not even the escape of sleep. He had crossed a line. And there was no coming back. The hours passed. Or was it days? Time lost all meaning in the oppressive silence of the cell. And then, finally, the darkness began to settle in. The room grew colder. And Alan's mind grew darker. This was the price of his choices. Not just the loss of his freedom, but the loss of his very self. There would be no redemption here. No forgiveness. Just the endless echo of the truth. Repeating, again and again. In the emptiness of his soul. And when the lights finally went out, when the darkness swallowed him whole, there was only one thing left. The silence. The silence that would haunt him. Until the end of his days. The silence was suffocating, as though it had weight. It pressed against Alan's chest, filling his lungs, making every breath feel like an effort. It was as if the world had evaporated, leaving him stranded in this tiny cell. His thoughts the only company. He tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. The mattress was thin and lumpy, unforgiving, just like the walls that surrounded him. His body ached from the unrelenting tension, but his mind was far worse. Every corner of the room felt like a reminder. The walls, the bed, the harsh flickering light overhead. Everything was a reminder of what he had done, of who he had become. The memories of Carla haunted him with brutal clarity. Her eyes, wide with shock and betrayal. That moment when she realized the truth. When she realized that her life had been snuffed out by his hand. He could almost feel the weight of that moment. Like a noose tightening around his neck. Why? The question was never far from his mind. And every time he thought he might escape it, it came back sharper. More insistent. Why? There was no answer. There was nothing to say. No excuse, no justification. Just the truth, raw and ugly. He had taken her life. And in doing so, he had erased his own. Days bled into each other in the oppressive stillness. The small window high on the wall provided no comfort. It was too small to see anything beyond the prison walls. Just a sliver of sky. A tiny reminder that there was a world outside. But not for him. The clang of metal bars. The shuffle of footsteps in the corridor. The distant sounds of other prisoners muttering to themselves. This was his world now. And then, one day, there was a knock on the door. It was a sound that pierced the thick veil of silence. And Alan froze. The door creaked open. And a guard stepped inside. He didn't speak at first, just looked at Alan with cold eyes. For a moment, nothing happened. Alan's heart hammered in his chest. The oppressive quiet of the cell returning. But only for a brief second. Then the guard said, "You have a visitor." The words landed like a shockwave. A visitor? Who would come for him now? Who could possibly want to see him? After everything he had done? His mind raced. Carla's face flashed before his eyes again. And the familiar weight of guilt slammed into him. The guard didn't wait for Alan to respond. He motioned for Alan to stand. With a deep breath, Alan rose from the bed. His legs shaky. His whole body stiff from days of sitting in the same position. He followed the guard down the hall. The sound of his footsteps muffled by the thick stone walls. His heart was in his throat now. Pounding, rapid. Who could it be? And why now? They reached the visiting area. A sterile room with a small table and 2 chairs. The guard motioned for Alan to sit. Alan's hands trembled as he sat down, looking up to find the visitor. It was a woman. Her face was unfamiliar at first. But then it hit him. It was Mary, Carla's sister. Her eyes were red. Her face gaunt. As if she hadn't slept in days. But what hit Alan the hardest was the look in her eyes. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't anger. It was sorrow. A sorrow that seemed deeper than anything Alan could ever understand. She stared at him for a long moment. The silence between them thick and suffocating. Then, finally, she spoke. "You're the one who killed her." The words weren't a question. They weren't an accusation. They were just the truth. A simple statement of what Alan already knew. He nodded slowly, his eyes filling with tears. He didn't deserve her forgiveness. He didn't deserve anything. Mary sat down across from him, her hands trembling as she folded them on the table. "Do you know what you've done?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alan nodded again, unable to speak. Carla's face was still there. In his mind, in his heart. Her voice still echoed in his ears. And now, in front of him, was the consequence of his actions. The sister of the woman he had taken from the world. "I just want to know why," Mary said, her voice cracking. "Why her? Why did you take her from me?" The question was simple. But Alan couldn't answer it. He couldn't find the words. The truth was too much for him to bear. Too much for anyone to bear. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Mary didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, looking at him with a sadness that broke Alan's heart all over again. Finally, she stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you," she said, her voice steady now. "But I wanted you to hear it. The real cost of what you did." And with that, she turned and walked away. Alan sat there, motionless. The weight of her words settling on him like a stone. There was no forgiveness for him. There could be no redemption. Only the silence. The unending silence of the cell. The only place left for him. The door closed behind Mary with a soft, almost respectful click. Her footsteps faded down the hallway. Each step taking her further from him. Further from the world Alan had once known. The room felt colder now. The chair across from him was still warm from her presence. But it might as well have been empty. It was just another reminder of the emptiness he had created. Alan sat there, staring at the spot where she had been. His mind numb. Her words repeated in his ears. Asterisk the real cost of what you did. Asterisk. He closed his eyes. But it didn't stop the images from flooding his mind. Carla. Mary. Her pleading eyes. Every face he had destroyed haunted him now. Each one more vivid than the last. But even the tears he'd shed couldn't wash it away. The silence of the cell was different now. It wasn't just the quiet of an empty room. It was the weight of everything he had lost. Every moment he had spent pretending to be someone else. Someone better. Alan had never truly understood what it meant to lose everything. But now he did. The quiet was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the absence of hope. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady. The cold air seemed to bite into his skin. But he didn't flinch. He didn't care. His fingers brushed against the rough walls of the cell. The stone was cold. Unyielding. It didn't care that he was broken. It didn't care that he was sorry. He walked to the small window in the corner. The bars were thick, and the view beyond them was nothing but a sliver of the sky. A gray expanse of clouds, distant and indifferent. It was a cruel joke, really. He had taken a life because he thought he could escape. And now, he was stuck in this small, suffocating space, with nothing but his thoughts, and the long, endless days ahead. The sound of footsteps approached again. This time, it was the guard, his keys jangling as he unlocked the door. "You have to come with me," the guard said, his tone flat. But there was something in his voice that made Alan freeze. It wasn't routine. It wasn't just another check or another order. Alan hesitated. His heart picked up pace. "What now?" The guard stepped inside, his eyes giving away nothing. "You've been called," he said. Alan's brow furrowed. "Called," he repeated, his voice hollow. The guard didn't respond, just gestured for Alan to follow. A strange knot formed in Alan's stomach as he stepped out of his cell. He had no idea where they were taking him, but part of him already knew. They walked in silence through the winding halls of the prison. The sounds of other prisoners muttering, shouting, echoing off the walls. But none of it reached him. His thoughts were too loud, too consuming. Finally, they reached a small room at the end of the hall. Alan couldn't see what was inside, but he felt the air shift. A tension he couldn't place. The guard knocked on the door, and a voice from within called out, "Enter." The door opened, and Alan stepped into the room. The first thing he noticed was the large, heavy desk in the center, behind which sat a man, his back to Alan. The man turned slowly, his features hidden in shadow at first. Then, he stood up. Alan's heart skipped a beat. It was Marshall, the detective who had broken him down months ago, who had heard his confession, who had watched him crumble. Marshall's gaze locked onto Alan's. Cold, calculating. "I didn't expect you to be here," Alan said, his voice shaking. He hadn't seen Marshall since the trial. Marshall didn't respond right away. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning Alan carefully, as if measuring him. Alan could feel the weight of the room pressing in again. Everything felt different, more dangerous. Finally, Marshall spoke, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk," he said. Alan didn't say anything. What could he say? There was nothing left to hide. The silence stretched on between them, and Alan wondered just how much more his mind could take. Marshall's gaze didn't waver. It was unnerving, like he could see right through Alan, right to the very core of him. Alan shifted uneasily, the tension in the air thickening with each passing second. He knew something was wrong. Something bigger than the quiet conversation he had anticipated. Marshall took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, methodical. The sound of his shoes clicking on the cold floor seemed to echo in Alan's mind, amplifying the quiet dread that crept up on him. "You think this is over, don't you?" Marshall asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. Alan's heart rate spiked. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already had a sinking feeling. Marshall's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "There's always more to the story, Alan. Always." Alan's throat tightened. His pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. Marshall moved closer now, pulling something from his jacket pocket. A folder. He opened it slowly, letting the sound of paper shuffle between them. Alan's eyes went to the contents, his breath catching in his throat. The photographs. The ones he thought had been lost. The ones he thought he'd erased from his mind. But there they were, laid out on the desk in front of him. Carla. Her face. Her body, twisted in that awful final moment. The room seemed to shrink. Alan's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about Carla, was it? Marshall's voice cut through the suffocating silence. There was more. There's always more. Alan's mind raced. What was he saying? What was Marshall talking about? Marshall leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Alan's. I've been digging into your life. Alan. I've been digging into your past. And I found something. A chill ran down Alan's spine. The air in the room turned frigid. Almost unbearable. Marshall's voice dropped lower. As if savoring the moment. You weren't the first one to die that night, Alan. There was someone else. Someone you didn't mention in your confession. Alan's stomach lurched. His vision blurred. He tried to shake his head. But his body wouldn't obey. Marshall's words sank in. Cold and sharp. Like a knife twisting in his gut. You see, Alan, Marshall continued. I found evidence. Hidden away, in the most unexpected places. Things you didn't think we'd ever uncover. The truth crashed down on Alan with the force of a tidal wave. His throat was dry. He felt sick. Like his body was betraying him. Turning on him in the worst way possible. He opened his mouth. But no words came out. All he could do was stare at the photos. His mind spinning. Unable to make sense of it. Marshall stood up straight now. Closing the folder with a snap. He turned his back on Alan. His hands clasped behind him. You've been hiding something, haven't you? Marshall asked quietly. His voice cold, almost pitying. You thought you could get away with it. But you didn't. Not really. Alan wanted to scream. Wanted to run. But his legs felt like lead. His mind was a maze. Every thought twisting and turning on itself. Unable to find a way out. Do you want to know what I found, Alan? Marshall's voice was like ice. Cutting through the fog in Alan's head. Alan swallowed hard. He nodded. Though part of him wanted to refuse. Marshall turned to face him again. His eyes darker now. More intense. You didn't just kill Carla, Alan. You killed someone else. Someone close to you. Someone who never made it to that night. Alan's breath caught in his throat. No. Marshall stepped forward. His presence looming over Alan like a shadow. You killed your own brother, Alan. And you buried it deep. But it was always there. The words hit Alan like a freight train. His legs buckled. His vision spun. He couldn't breathe. Marshall didn't wait for Alan to respond. Instead, he continued. His voice low. Like he was relishing in the moment. You thought you could bury it all. Didn't you? You thought your lies would protect you. Alan's world crumbled. He felt the floor beneath him shift. The walls closing in. As though the entire prison had started to collapse around him. Everything he had done. Everything he had tried to escape from. It was all coming back. All of it. The truth. And in that moment, Alan knew there was no running from it. Not now. Not ever. Marshall watched him. Quietly. As Alan finally understood the full extent of his own destruction. Alan's knees buckled. His body sinking slowly to the cold floor. The truth hit him like a sledgehammer. His breath came in shallow gasps. As if the air itself had turned thick and unbearable. His brother? The thought wouldn't leave him. He could barely comprehend it. Barely process the magnitude of what Marshall had just said. How could he have forgotten? How could he have buried it all so deep? Even from himself? His mind raced back. Back to a time before all this. Before Carla. A time when he had been someone else. Someone whole. But the memories felt distant now. Like they belonged to someone else entirely. The image of his brother flashed before him. A younger version of Alan. carefree, laughing with his sibling in the warmth of their childhood home. But then, the picture fractured. The jagged edges of his past began to bleed through. The fight. The argument. The night he lost control. Alan's hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the table. The world felt far away. His heart thundered in his chest. Marshall's cold eyes bore into him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Alan felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to scream. But he couldn't. The words were caught in his throat, drowned by the suffocating reality of his own actions. His brother's face haunted him. The memory of that night. The confrontation. The blow. It had all come rushing back. Like a dam breaking after years of pressure. And now there was no stopping it. Marshall, watching him closely, finally spoke. "You thought you could outrun your past, Alan. But it was never really gone. Was it?" Alan wanted to speak. To beg for mercy. But all he could do was nod. There were no excuses. No words to undo what he had done. The silence in the room stretched on. It was heavy now. Weighted with years of guilt. Of buried secrets. Of broken lives. And then, slowly, Marshall placed the folder in front of Alan. The photographs of Carla's final moments. His brother's death. The evidence of a life Alan had tried to erase. Alan stared at them. Unable to look away. The faces on the photographs didn't just belong to the people he had destroyed. They were the ghosts of his past. The demons that had always been with him. Lurking in the shadows of his memory. "I can't," Alan began, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to." Marshall's expression softened. But only for a second. "I know," he said quietly. "But it doesn't change the facts, does it?" Alan could feel the walls closing in again. His chest tight with panic. The weight of the truth was unbearable. So much heavier than anything physical. It pressed down on him. Relentless. He closed his eyes. Trying to escape. But there was no escape. Not now. Not ever. For a long time. Neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was the presence of everything Alan had tried to forget. Finally, Marshall broke the quiet. "Alan, we need to talk about the details. The truth, about everything." Alan shook his head. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to go back. But he knew there was no avoiding it. The door to his cell had been closed a long time ago. But now, it wasn't just the prison walls that held him in. It was his own mind. His own shattered self. Marshall stepped closer. "Do you understand, Alan? You can't hide from this anymore. Not from the truth. Not from your actions." Alan nodded. His hands pressed to his face. How had it come to this? It was too late to ask questions. The damage had already been done. Marshall leaned back slightly, giving Alan a moment to collect himself. The detective's eyes softened, but only briefly. "This isn't just about your brother, or Carla. Or what you did that night," he said slowly. "This is about everything. About who you are now." Alan's body trembled. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Too thick to breathe. "I know what you're thinking, Alan," Marshall continued. "You're thinking it's too late. That you've lost it all. But you still have a choice." A choice? Alan's mind barely registered the words. He was too lost in the spiraling flood of memories. The weight of guilt pressing down on him like an anchor. But Marshall was right. There was no escaping it. Not anymore. The truth. His truth. The road to redemption seemed too far. Too impossible. But Marshall's presence, cold and unwavering, reminded him that some truths were too powerful to ignore. And as Alan sat there, facing the consequences of his actions, he knew that his story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The room felt smaller now. The air seemed thicker. More suffocating. Alan could feel his pulse in his throat. His chest tight as if the walls were closing in on him. He wanted to speak. But the words were locked inside. Buried under the weight of everything he had just learned. Marshall watched him quietly. A strange, almost sympathetic look in his eyes. But it wasn't the look of a man who was ready to offer forgiveness. It was the look of someone who understood the depths of Alan's fall. And was prepared to watch him face the consequences. "Do you know what it means, Alan?" Marshall's voice broke the silence. Low but steady. Alan glanced up at him. Nodding slowly. Though he wasn't sure he fully understood. Marshall stepped closer. Placing a hand on the back of the chair Alan had collapsed into. "It means you have to face it all. Every single thing you've done. Every lie. Every betrayal." The words seemed to weigh more than they should have. More than any prison sentence ever could. Alan could feel them sinking in. Burrowing deep into the cracks of his fractured mind. "You can't outrun the truth," Marshall continued. "You've been running from it your entire life. But it's always been there. Lurking in the background." Alan wanted to scream. Wanted to argue. But there was nothing left to say. Nothing that hadn't already been said in that room. By him. By the detective. By Carla's sister. He felt empty. Numb. Like the life he had once known had been erased. Leaving only the remnants of the man who sat before Marshall now. "Do you think she'd want you to keep hiding, Alan?" Marshall asked suddenly. His voice cutting through Alan's thoughts. "Do you think Carla would want you to keep burying the truth? To keep pretending none of it ever happened?" The question hit Alan like a slap to the face. He recoiled. His mind racing. No. He thought. Carla wouldn't want that. But what could he do now? He had already destroyed everything. Her life. His brother's life. His own. There was no going back. The guilt burned deeper. More intense now. As if the reality of his actions had finally sunk in. He had killed 2 people. Not just one. Marshall was right. There was no escaping it. No more lies. "There's still a choice," Marshall said. Almost as if reading Alan's mind. "A choice to stop running. A choice to face what you've done. To face the people you've hurt. The lives you've destroyed." Alan's eyes filled with tears. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of realization. There would be no redemption. Not for him. Not now. "Tell me, Alan," Marshall asked quietly. "Do you want to make this right?" Alan's hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the chair. The question hung in the air. It was too much. Too overwhelming. Could he even try to make it right? Or had everything he had done sealed his fate forever? For a long moment. The room remained still. The silence between them thick and unbearable. Then Alan finally spoke. His voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can." Marshall nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "I don't think you can either. But it's the only choice you have left." Alan stared at the floor. His hands shaking. His mind was a blur. But through the fog, he understood what Marshall meant. It wasn't about redemption. Not anymore. It was about accepting the truth. About facing the consequences of his actions. There was no going back. There was no erasing the past. But maybe, just maybe, if he could face it, if he could confront the nightmare of his own making, then he might find some kind of peace. But it wouldn't be easy. And it would never be enough to undo what he had done. "Okay," Alan whispered. His voice cracking under the weight of his surrender. "I'll face it." Marshall didn't say anything. He simply turned and walked to the door. Before he left, he paused and looked back at Alan. His expression unreadable. For what it's worth, Alan, he said quietly. Facing the truth is the hardest part. The door closed with a soft click behind him. And Alan was left alone once more. Sitting in the cold, silent room. The truth was no longer something he could hide from. It was the only thing left in his world. And as the reality of it settled into his bones, he knew there was no escape. No freedom. Only the truth. And the cost of facing it. The cell door creaked open once more. Alan's heart skipped a beat as he looked up. It wasn't Marshall this time. It was someone else. A figure stood in the doorway. Silent, still. For a moment, Alan thought it was a trick of the light. His mind was clouded. But when the figure stepped forward, his breath caught in his throat. It was Mary. The last person he ever expected to see again. Her face was pale. Her eyes hollow. But there was something different about her. Something sharp in the way she moved. Mary? Alan's voice trembled. Like a man waking from a nightmare. Only to find it had followed him into his waking world. She didn't answer at first. She just stood there. Silent, studying him. I thought you were gone, Alan whispered. Mary's lips curled into a thin, unreadable smile. She stepped closer. Slowly, deliberately. And for the first time, Alan felt the cold edge of fear. Her presence was like a shadow. Unnaturally still. But somehow, more imposing than anyone else he had ever faced. I wasn't gone, Alan, she finally said, her voice low. Cold. I was always here. Waiting. Alan blinked, confusion clouding his thoughts. Waiting for what? He wanted to ask. But his throat tightened. Choked by the dread that suddenly gripped him. Mary's eyes didn't leave his. She took another step forward. The truth isn't just something you face, Alan. It's something you live with. Alan swallowed hard. His mouth dry. He didn't understand. He wanted to scream. But his mind was paralyzed. Mary reached into her coat pocket. Her hand emerging with something small. A piece of paper. Do you remember this? She asked. Holding it out to him. Alan took it. His hands shaking. The paper was folded. Creased with age. But when he opened it, he saw it. A photograph of Carla. And underneath it, a note. Asterisk you took from me. Now, I will take from you, asterisk. Alan's blood ran cold. The words seemed to burn themselves into his memory. And that's when it hit him. What Mary meant. She had known. All along. His body trembled. His mind racing. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Why, he finally croaked. His voice barely audible. Why would you? Mary stepped closer. Her expression hardening. Because you took everything, Alan. You took my sister. You took my family. Her eyes flared with something darker now. Something more dangerous than Alan had ever seen. I wasn't waiting for you to face the truth. Alan, Mary said coldly. I was waiting for you to understand the cost of your lies. And then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the cell. Leaving Alan to confront the one truth he had never fully acknowledged. The past wasn't just something he had to live with. It was something that would follow him. Haunt him. Until the very end. For the first time in years, Alan understood the true price of his actions. The truth wasn't just a burden. It was a debt. And no matter how hard he tried, there was no way to repay it. Alan sat alone in the cold silence of his cell. The weight of Mary's words hung heavy in the air, crushing him with an unbearable truth. He had lived his entire life pretending to be someone he wasn't. Hiding from the pain of his past. Burying the guilt so deep that he almost convinced himself it had disappeared. But now, everything had shattered. The walls he'd built around himself had crumbled. And in their place was nothing but the raw, exposed reality of who he truly was. He stared at the photograph Mary had left him. Carla's face stared back. Her eyes frozen in a moment of terror that would haunt him forever. The words beneath it cut through him like a blade. Asterisk, you took from me. Now, I will take from you. Asterisk. The guilt, once a distant ache, was now a suffocating weight that crushed his chest. He had taken so much. From Carla, from his brother, from himself. And there was no escape. But in that moment, as the echoes of his past reverberated in his mind, something shifted within him. He understood now. There was no running, no more lies. He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't fix the destruction he'd caused. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live with it. To face the consequences without hiding. The days ahead would be long, painful, and uncertain. But Alan knew one thing. He would never be the same. The prison around him wasn't just made of stone and iron bars. It was the prison of his own making. Constructed from the lies, the secrets, the choices he had made. And yet, even as he sat there, feeling the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future, there was a flicker of something else. A small ember of acceptance. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a beginning. Alan knew he had to walk through the fire. Face the ashes of his past. And whatever came after that, he would face it with his eyes wide open. For the first time in years, he was no longer hiding. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward truly understanding what it meant to be free. The cell door slammed shut behind him. But Alan, for the first time, felt the weight lift. Just slightly. As he stepped into the unknown.